Aaron was at the UN testifying for his third time, and let's remind people that of why we're in Syria. One of the big reasons is
we're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
So I like this. It says, so where are the sanctions for the United States? And when did the U.S. oligarchs have their property confiscated? Then when is the discussion on visa bans for U.S. citizens entering the European Union? So, okay, of course, right? So we're the world's terrorists, and then we pretend that we care about things like that when it's one of our enemies. Aaron Maté just reminds everybody the U.S. claims to be in Syria to be fighting ISIS, but it rarely fights ISIS. It's actually there to deny Syria its own oil and wheat, and to occasionally attack Syrians and their allies who defeated the United States-backed sectarian death squads in the dirty war. So that's why we're really there. And nobody really knows the real reason, but, RFK Jr. posited a long time ago that it was because they wanted to put a pipeline from Qatar and have it go through Syria. I think that was the idea. So anyway, but nobody really knows. But it's got something to do with fossil fuels. So this is how they reported. There was in 2018, there was a gas attack on people, on Syrians. And that's how it gets reported. Syrian regime found responsible for Duma, a chemical attack. And then when they report it like that, immediately what's the result of those reports? Trump announces strikes on Syria following suspected chemical weapons. So they have to do that, and then they can bomb them under the guise of, this. And I don't know how bombing helps people who are killed in a gas attack anyway. It doesn't. And so, we're mad at the Syrian government. Let's blow the shit out of their people. And so when the gas attacks happen, and then the corporate media just immediately says whatever the State Department and the war machine wants them to, and then they go over to check, make sure that the gas. A gas attack really happened here.
And there's definitely something that stings.
Yeah, it stings. That if you thought there was a deadly chemical weapon on something, the first thing you would do as a reporter, give me it. Oh yeah, it doesn't smell like a false flag. Anyway, so if you Google, so they used that fake. They tried to say that Assad had gassed his own people, and so what they used that pretense to bomb Syria, right? So if you Google, now Aaron Maté has done his reporting and he's debunked that, right? That there's many questions. You can't, and it's all the evidence points the other way. And if you Google the Duma attack, gas attack, this is what comes up. Watchdog blames Syria for the Duma chemical attack. Chemical weapons watchdog blames Syrian Air Force for the Duma chemical attack and the fog of Syria. OPCW blames Syria government for the 2018 chlorine gas attack. And then reasonable grounds to believe Syrian government did the... Okay, there is no reason. Okay, so Aaron Maté then has... But he went to the UN, and I just want to show you a minute of this because he looks good in a suit. Here we go.
I have to say that I find it unfortunate that nearly 5 years after that alleged incident in Duma, this controversy around the OPCW investigation is still being debated in public rather than being addressed by the OPCW. Because fundamentally, this is a controversy that is internal to the OPCW. And at the heart of it are at least 2 veteran inspectors from the OPCW with nearly 30 years of combined experience, who worked on the Duma investigation, who deployed to Syria for the Duma investigation. And what they say is very simple. They have accused senior officials at the OPCW of suppressing findings from their probe and putting out unsupported conclusions that baselessly implicate the Syrian government in a chemical attack. And they are not demanding that their own opinions be affirmed as the ultimate truth. They just want the right to be heard. And rather than hearing these inspectors, allowing them to come in and voice their concerns, allowing the OPCW to weigh the findings that were suppressed, the OPCW has refused to meet with them, and he's even denigrated them in public, which I will get into. So when I talk about the suppression of the Duma probe, it's a long story which I've gone through before, so I won't repeat the whole story. But let me just to illustrate, give you one example of the documented suppression of the findings of the Duma probe, which nobody contests. This is uncontested fact. So the alleged chemical attack happens on April 7th, 2018.
Well, let me bring you in. Let me bring in Aaron right here. So, first of all, if those chemical weapons inspectors who went against the OPCW's official narrative, and they were considered whistleblowers, if they can't get a hearing or get to speak at the UN, how come you get invited? And if Jose Bustiano, who's to be the former head of the OPCW, who also agrees with your narrative on Syria gas attacks, can't get a hearing at the UN, how do you get invited?
Jose Bustani, the first director general of the OPCW, who was ousted by the Bush administration back in 2002, 2003, because he was opposing the Iraq War. He was invited to speak at a UN Security Council meeting in the fall of 2020, but the US, UK, and France led the way in blocking him from speaking because he was going to come out in defense of the dissenting OPCW inspectors in the Duma investigation and call for accountability. And that was a different kind of meeting where other states can block speakers. At the one where I was invited to, I don't think there's that option. So that's why I was given the chance to speak here. Oh,
okay. All right. And so so I noticed that there was a rash of articles written recently that was confirming the BS narrative that Assad gassed his own people. It's inexplicable. He was winning the war. Why would you kill those people? It was only like a couple of dozen people they claimed he killed anyway. Why would you use chemicals? Everything points the other way that he would do that. So why all of a sudden were all these articles written recently that claim that was the true narrative, that Assad did it himself? And then go ahead.
Yeah. So a quick timeline. So April 7, 2018 is when this alleged chemical attack occurred. There are videos put out of dozens of dead bodies from the scene. The people are foaming at the mouth. They've collapsed dead in piles. And the insurgents who controlled Syria at the time, Duma at the time, this town of Duma, and their allies, the White Helmets, which is a group funded by the US and UK and other NATO states, they all claim that the victims have suffered a chemical attack. And about a year later, in March 2019, the OPCW puts out a final report that says that, yes, there are reasonable grounds to believe that this was a chemical attack with chlorine gas. And they don't say who did it, but the obvious inference that they want you to come away with is that Syria was guilty. So that's March 2019, about a year after the original incident. But then we get all these leaks from inside the OPCW. And these leaks show that the actual original team that went to Syria for this mission and then came back and wrote up an original report, that they did not reach that conclusion, that they actually collected a lot of evidence that this was not a chemical attack, but that this incident was staged by insurgents on the ground, which makes sense, right? Even if before you look at all the evidence, just think of it logically. The US has laid down what's called the red line. Obama announced it, saying that if chemical weapons are used, that would change our calculus, and we would militarily intervene. So if you're Syria, why would you do the one thing that you know would invite military intervention against you? You're already facing the most well-funded insurgency in history, billions of dollars spent by the US, UK, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Israel, France, flooding Syria with weapons to an insurgency dominated by al-Qaeda. So you're already facing that. Why would you now do the one thing that you know will get the US Air Force to act on al-Qaeda's behalf? It doesn't make any sense. And why, by the way, does Syria never gas all these insurgents that are taking over its territory? Like Idlib right now is controlled by al-Qaeda. How come al-Qaeda never got hit with chemical weapons, but yet for some reason Syria chooses to use them against innocent civilians inside an apartment building? So just even logically, it's so ridiculous. And obviously, the obvious answer is that this is just like the Iraq WMD playbook. You need a pretext to justify sanctioning Syria, bombing Syria occasionally, and continuing the dirty war. And now continuing the U.S. military occupation of Syria, which, by the way, just led to a U.S. Contractor being killed because the U.S. is still there. And when the State Department says why we need to be there, what do they say? It's because Syria gassed its own people. So that's really the reasons behind these chemical weapons allegations. So anyway, the leaks show that the original team collected all this evidence that was suppressed. And when all this comes out, it's published at WikiLeaks. Robert Fisk, the late, great journalist, British journalist, writes about it. It gets attention. What does the OPCW do? It basically says there's nothing to see here. These two dissenting inspectors, the ones we know about, they're uninformed. They don't matter. And they refuse to have any accountability whatsoever. And then there's basically a disinformation campaign launched against the dissenting inspectors and people like myself and Max Blumenthal and Roger Waters, who speak out in their defense. So the BBC, which is a UK state-funded outlet, and Bellingcat, a NATO troll farm, put out all these ridiculous attacks on the whistleblowers. And this goes on for many years, and we've talked about it over the years. So finally, in January of this year, they've done the same thing to this show. If you go to my Wikipedia page, that I've called a conspiracy theorist because of this very thing. It's in Wikipedia. It says CNN. It's called Jimmy Dore conspiracy theorist over the gas attacks of Assad on his own people. Well, he didn't do it on his own people. And
Jimmy, are you accusing the government of lying about weapons of mass destruction?
Anyway,
and Jimmy, listen, the difference between you and me is that you called bullshit on this one from the start. Whereas I only came along after the whistleblowers and the leaks from the OPCW came out. And that's when I really got involved in the story. So as always, you deserve a lot of credit there for
you're very generous
to call this one out.
You're very generous.
Well, it's true. It's just true. So finally in January of this year, after years of stonewalling accountability, so insulting the whistleblowers in public, putting out false claims about them, all of which I've debunked in over 12 articles at the Gray Zone, which no one's ever written a single response to. After blocking people like Jose Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW, when he tries to speak in their defense, the U.S. and their allies block him from speaking. So after years of that, finally in January, we get the OPCW coming out with a new report from something called its Investigation and Identification Team. And this is a new team that's been set up pretty much at the behest of the U.S. and its allies. And their mandate is to identify the perpetrators of chemical attacks in Syria. Their actual mandate is to whitewash U.S.-led allegations like the one in Duma. So they put out this long report that makes the case that, yes, Syria was guilty of the attack in Duma. And they, it's a very long report. On the surface, some people reading it might be impressed by it. But as I've shown now in 2 articles at the Gray Zone, it is riddled with gaping holes. And it's basically an attempt to answer the dissenting inspectors without directly answering them, because they can't directly answer them because because the dissenting inspectors have the facts on their side. So it's basically a tacit effort to try to paper over all the previous flaws in the Duma probe. The problem is, to paper over the previous flaws, they have to come up with a whole bunch of new deceptions. And that's what I've debunked at the Gray Zone in 2 articles and also in my comments at the UN.
It's so how does the corruption of an institution like the OPCW happen like this?
Well, look, we got an example 20 years ago with Jose Bustani. He was the founding Director General of this organization. And right after he was elected to a new 5-year term, the Bush administration came in and forced him out. Why? Because he was trying to bring Iraq into the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the Bush administration knew that if Bustani succeeded in that would subject Iraq to regular inspections, which would show that Iraq had no chemical weapons. And once that happened, that would make it a lot harder for Bush to invade Iraq. So John Bolton personally flew over to The Hague, to Bustani's office, said to him, "You have to resign." And Bustani said no. And John Bolton literally said to him, "We know where your kids live." And Bustani said, "I'm not resigning." So then John Bolton went, and behind the scenes, they bullied enough states into basically agreeing to oust Bustani in a vote. And just for good measure, the U.S. threatened to withhold its share of the OPCW's budget, which would have made the OPCW impossible to operate. And I've interviewed Jose Bustani before, and he tells this story, and it's an amazing story. I interviewed him on my podcast, Pushback. It's incredible. He also found out during this time that his office was being bugged, and there was even a mole inside who was working for whoever was bugging him, and we can guess who was the state party that was bugging him. So anyway, that's when the corruption started. When he was ousted, that was a sign that the OPCW was not going to be an impartial, independent institution. It was subjected to be compromised, to compromise by the U.S. and its allies. And so, fast forward now to Duma in 2018, the OPCW gets on the ground for the first time in Syria to investigate an alleged chemical attack. The actual investigators find no evidence of the chemical attack. What happens to them? Their findings get censored. The original team gets sidelined, and all this deception is put forth. And I'll just give you one example. And I talked about this in my UN remarks, but I think this is the easiest part to understand when it comes to how much fraud has gone into propping up this narrative. Okay. So one of the complaints of the original dissenting inspectors of the previous OPCW reports about Duma was that they were making unsupported claims to assert that there was evidence of chemical weapons in Duma, particularly chlorine gas, which is what the OPCW claims. So what do we get now in this new OPCW report put out by the IIT, the Investigation and Identification Team? To prove their case that there is evidence of chlorine gas in Duma, they say they found what they call a marker chemical. And a marker chemical basically means a smoking gun. It's a signature that basically means the presence of this chemical means there was chlorine gas. But guess what? And I've written about this and I talked about this at the UN. This sample that the supposed marker chemical came from has appeared out of nowhere. In all the previous OPCW reports about Duma, it was never even acknowledged. So there's a long table in March 2019 of all the samples that the OPCW collected in Duma and all the samples they received from third party. And the supposed smoking gun didn't even exist then. So nearly 5 years later, the OPCW has basically pulled it out of a hat, out of the blue. It's come out of nowhere, which is unprecedented. Why did we not know about this new magic smoking gun sample until now? And then it gets worse when you find out how it was obtained, because this sample wasn't even collected by the OPCW. The OPCW says it was collected by a third party. And they don't tell us who that third party is, but that
violates their own rules of an investigation, right? Where they only are supposed to analyze things that they themselves have collected, and now they're using a third party collecting this sample that's supposed to confirm that Assad did this, but they won't even tell you who the third party is, even if they did, that would still break their rules.
Yeah. In any serious investigation, criminal investigation, you only want to test evidence, samples you can verify yourself. If some third party comes in and says, hey, guess what? I found this sample, then you can't trust it. And that's what the OPCW rules say, that basically unless a sample is collected by the OPCW, it will not be accepted as valid. And in this case, this sample, I would bet anything, was collected by the White Helmets, which is a group that cooperates with insurgents, that is funded by the US and UK, and in Duma was caught faking a hospital scene to make it look as if they were treating victims of a chemical attack, when there's now been multiple reports by journalists, even from the BBC, who said that this hospital scene was staged. The hospital scene was staged by the White Helmets. And the White Helmets have bragged publicly that they gave the OPCW samples from Duma. So I would bet you anything that this new smoking gun sample, which appeared out of nowhere, came from the White Helmets. And even if it came from anybody else, it doesn't matter. It's not collected by the OPCW. And so therefore, it just can't be trusted. And previously, the OPCW has said explicitly, we would never, ever weigh a sample that we have not collected ourselves. But that has been forgotten in Duma all of a sudden. And then you find out, it gets even more. So, okay, the samples appeared from nowhere. It's collected by a third party. And then you find out that actually the OPCW used this sample over a sample that its own inspector has actually collected from the exact same spot. So this sample supposedly comes from the room under one of the cylinders in Duma, some concrete debris in the room under the cylinder. The OPCW collected a sample from that exact same location. But for some reason, they chose to rely on a brand new sample that somebody else collected. It's so shady. Like in any serious investigation, it would never be accepted. For some reason now, it's become a new smoking gun.
So do you think so? I mean, I think it's great. Your reporting is great because I can then point people to, printed documents and things like that. You're a great investigator of this. So you've been invited to speak 3 times now at the UN. It seems like in me, like, I don't want to be a cynic, right? But I am now. So I'll just admit it. And I just don't. Do you think that there'll be a positive outcome from this? Or do you think that things will just keep getting worse until we're all dead?
Well, listen, Jimmy, I'll give you one reason to be cynical, but then one reason to be optimistic, okay? The reason to be cynical is that when the OPCW came out with this new report with this brand new smoking gun sample and all these other deceptions back in January, when all the media, establishment media in the US reported on this, none of them even mentioned the OPCW whistleblower's existence. So the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, all these other outlets, Al Jazeera, all of them said the OPCW finds Syria guilty of the chemical attack in Duma. None of them mentioned that the original team from the OPCW that went to Duma wrote up an original report that said there was no chemical attack, or there was no evidence of a chemical attack. So the OPCW leaks are so damning to this narrative of chemical weapons in Syria that there's so much effort being deployed to erase the leaks and the whistleblowers. And no matter how many times I try to, bring this up with the reporters, so-called reporters who write this stuff, they don't listen. This is such a damning story to their narrative that there's such an effort to make it go away. Okay, so that is a cause for cynicism, because if people can't even know about the OPCW leaks existence, how will they ever know the real story? It's memory hold. It's out of Orwell, right? But on the positive side, at this meeting on Friday where I spoke, a really important development happened. For the first time, Brazil, which is the largest country in South America, one of the biggest countries in the world, they came out in support of accountability for this scandal, which is huge. The representative from Brazil basically challenged the claims of the OPCW and pointed out that a Brazilian diplomat, Jose Bustani, was silenced and asked me some questions about what could be done to address this cover-up. And that is a huge geopolitical shift. And so I could tell you from being in the room when this Brazilian representative was speaking, the delegates from the US and UK were not happy. And actually, a few of them started furiously texting on their phones because they were not expecting this, I don't think. Because this is a major shift for Brazil to come out in defense of accountability at the OPCW. So I left the meeting, feeling very optimistic from that. But again, Jimmy, we don't do this tethered to any outcome. We just do this to spread the truth and to give people the facts. And the more people learn the facts of the story, the more it's undeniable that there was a cover-up and that this has to be addressed.
I definitely have outcomes that I want.
Like what?
All right. Well, that's fine. So, and it's important because this is used as a pretext to kill people and to keep America thinking we're bombing bad guys instead of what we're doing, which is committing imperialism and economic hegemony, which is why we're still occupying a third of, as we try to indict Putin for war crimes, we're occupying a country right next door, a third of it, the part where all the food and the oil is. Yeah. And I have this loaded in here, but it's not really worth it. It's just, this is how they cover the airstrikes. They never talk, and they never tell you anything. Just listen how empty and vapid this is.
From here, Syrian commanders this morning have been examining the damage from last night's attacks. Limited airstrikes that the US-led coalition is now calling a success, but airstrikes that Russia says were acts of aggression. They were certainly airstrikes that President Assad in Damascus will have heard. Loud and clear.
So do you hear the news guy? The news guy's like, that's right. Assad heard it loud and clear. You mean that you were bombing parts of his city where people? Yeah. Okay, here we go. There it is.
The barrage of missiles came from ships and planes in the night. American, British, and these French warplanes firing over 100 missiles at 3 main targets in Syria. In the capital Damascus, Syrian air defenses tried to shoot them down, claiming to have hit 13. Massive explosions lighting up the night sky. As they fell, the president addressed the...
I think that's called terrorism. I'm pretty sure that's what that's called. If you would plant those bombs, that would be called terrorism.
It's not terror. It's just like if you ever had an apartment with a noisy neighbor upstairs.
Yeah.
That's just America's version of hitting the ceiling with a broom.
Yeah.
Let him hear it a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. Assad certainly heard it. That's the kind of empty, vapid, with absolutely no context that the corporate, and they're cheering it on. We're getting him. That asshole, Assad. That's what that is.
He did a great job with that, but not as good as Brian Wilson when he, or what not Brian Wilson, when he got guided.
Brian Williams.
Yeah, Williams. Sorry. Brian.
We were guided by the beauty of our weapons.
Yeah, that was the most, I think that was the quote of the day back then.
And they are beautiful, is what he said. And they are beautiful.
Did Assad acknowledge how beautiful it was at least?
And so I like what this guy says. Obviously, the United States can't leave Syria because then how would it fight the people who attack the United States soldiers who are in Syria? All right. Well, you know what? There actually is some news out of Syria, some big news out of Syria that's going to not be good for Americans' influence around the world. In fact, it's lessening the things they said that Donald Trump was going to do to our prestige and influence around the world. Joe Biden is pulling off very quickly. Go to jimmydore.com to see my new stand-up special, COVID Lies Are Funny. For only $10, you get to become a premium member, too. And come see us do our live shows. We're going to be doing stand-up comedy in Milwaukee, Nashville, Honolulu, Los Angeles, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, New York, Cohoes, New York, Hartford, Connecticut, Baltimore, Maryland, and more. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets.